Hello and welcome. If you're visiting today, we're glad you're visiting. We always start off by praying for another church in town. And today we're going to pray for the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Church. It's a hot mic. Can you turn it down a little bit? Yeah. And I'm pretty sure the priest's name is Andreas over there. So we're going to lift them up because we believe that's a really big deal to support each other in the churches around town. Let's pray for them in our time together. God, thank you so much. Thanks for this community, this family where we can meet together. We're thankful for the larger picture, God, the church universal around the world. And we're so thankful for the rich and beautiful heritage, God, of the Orthodox Church, God, 1,000 years of following you in their own unique and beautiful way. And we just pray for our brothers and sisters that meet there that they will experience you, God, that they will know you intimately and be aware of your presence. And pray that you bless our relationship with them is what we love. And we pray for our time in the Word today that we will hear from you. In Jesus' name, amen. It is suffocatingly hot on the stage. I don't know if you guys are experiencing the same thing without the lights out there. Kyle walked backstage and he looked like it had been raining on him. So I was getting a little nervous. And it is really hot. It's still ringing. Is there can you turn it down a little bit, Alex? It's still kind of hot up here. See what I did there? It's hot mic, hot temperature. Yeah, try to track with me. Here's the deal. Today was beautiful though, right? I mean, the monsoons have arrived. I was over on the west side of town at NAU's campus, and I was laying out in the grass earlier and reading, and the monsoons came in, and the smell of rain hit. Did you guys, anybody experience this first smell of rain today? Anybody else get intoxicated on it? Yeah, that's my problem. That's my drug. Love that ozone smell. Hit it up all day long. I really get excited about this time of year. I was hoping that the monsoons would cool it off in here, but I think instead we managed to trap all the heat and then pump humidity in here. And I think that's the perfect combo, so enjoy. I'll try to talk quickly today for sure. I had a really cool week. A lot of stuff going on this week. I had people come visit from out of town. I had some old friends from Texas, and my family came in town. But I got to do something really cool that I want to share with you guys, because what we're going to talk about today has everything to do with this idea of expectations. That's kind of where we're going with this. I'm going to explain in a little bit kind of the specific direction we're going. But the coolest thing that happened on Tuesday in my life, I got invited into a really cool process. And it actually started a few weeks ago when my friend Qua, I don't know how many of you guys know Qua and Abby, they're good friends of ours, coming around here for a while. Qua invited me to lunch, and he broke the top secret news that he was planning on proposing to Abby. And by the way, she knows all about this now. I'm not letting the cat out of the bag. At the time, this was top secret stuff. And so he wanted me to be a part of this really cool plan. Now, guys, you need to take notes. If you want to know how to propose to a girl, Quad did it right. So he explained to me at that lunch his grand plan. In fact, he had 3 sheets explaining to me with spreadsheets, with time frames, down to the 5 minutes, how things were going to focus. He wanted me to photograph this great event. Now, here's what's cool about it. Quan and Abby are really good rock climbers, and so his plan was they were going to rock climb their favorite spire in Sedona, and then he had got a helicopter that I would ride in as a photographer, so right at the right moment when he's proposing on top of the spire, I would be shooting shots of the helicopter. Pretty cool, right? In fact, Quan is so meticulous, he actually had a picture of he and Abby on top of a spire with a helicopter behind it with a helicopter circled. And I was like, man, I know what helicopter is, Quan. You are very detailed. He's an engineer, by the way. And in fact, so then as the day approached, as we got closer and closer, and by the way, I called Qua earlier today and asked him if I could share this story, but I didn't tell him I was going to be thrown under the bus the whole time, because that's really my plan. So as it got closer and closer, I got more and more emails and paperwork and schedules. In fact, as it went like minute by minute planning from his engineer mind, he actually even had the predicted temperatures on each 5-minute interval of what it would be. And it was really cool, though. Here's how it all went down. So the plan was, he had this helicopter, and the coolest part, there was 4 seats. And so Abby's parents, Alan and Lindy, and my wife Mark, I got to go to. So we got to ride down together early in the morning, get in this helicopter. You know, we had to be right on schedule so that when they were right at the top of the spire early in the morning, it worked out perfect. Beautiful stuff. It was really cool. We jumped in the helicopter, and I had all sorts of expectations. The main one was I knew I would get motion sickness, which I did a little bit, but it really blew my mind because the helicopters down there, they don't have doors on them. They're just like open sides. That helped a lot because there's like fresh air blowing in. And so we cruised up and we started flying over there, and it really all happened really fast because the way he had it scheduled to the minute, we basically took off from the Sedona airport and we're at the spire within like 3 minutes. So this was all like right at the beginning of our flight. We were diving into this. And so the plan was to be kind of like the circled helicopter in the background, like zooming in with the zoom lens while this all went down. And he had all these hand signals for us. to know when things were about to happen. He literally had one. He said, when I wave double peace signs, that means 20 seconds until proposal. This guy is dialed in. That's awesome. Paul's never going to speak to me again after that's it was really cool. I mean, he just cared. He was that excited about it. It was cool. So as we get cruising up there and we're flying around, we were kind of talking with the pilot before we got there about, okay, how close can we get and all this stuff. What we didn't realize is that this crazy pilot was some sort of like Apache helicopter ninja. And he could like basically land on their forehead. And he basically did that. So they climbed up to the top of this spire, and our expectation is to be kind of off in the distance. And all of a sudden we're literally like blowing their hair with our helicopter. We're right at the top of the spire with them. And it was funny because they all saw Abby say, "Is that Charlie?" Like she could see me smiling. What a coincidence. What are you guys doing up here? So, no, it was really, really cool. I gotta say, I really loved my proposal. I proposed to the mark on the edge of the cliff, but I think we got way out down. It was really cool. I talked to Qua about it though, and I was like, man, did it go as expected? And he was saying, well, no, not exactly, but it was awesome. And you know, can you guys relate with that experience? You have an idea or an expectation or something, and it doesn't match your expectation, but it was maybe better or different or awesome. And I was thinking, man, I can relate to that in a lot of things. I was in the bathroom right before we came out here. It's been a while since I made a bathroom reference, so throw it out there. And my son Colt was in there with me, and we were washing our hands, and then he went up to the dryer, and he stuck his hand under it, and nothing happened. And I kind of looked at him, and I was thinking, this will be interesting. And he kind of wiggled his hands a little bit, and nothing happened. And by the way, this is a box with a tube and a big silver button. Not a lot going on this thing. He's waving his hands, and he finally looks at me, bitter and angry, and goes, "Do I have to push that button?" I was like, okay, your expectation is not lining up with the rest of them. He's such a futuristic kid. It blew my mind the first time I saw a hair dryer, whatever. So the thing is, expectations are kind of crazy because they can give us an idea in our mind before we get there of something, and that can either really enhance the experience or tear it down. Now, if you're wondering where we're going, if you've been kind of traveling with us for the last month or so, we did a whole discussion called our Summer Book Club series. And every week we allowed you guys to pick a book and we review it no matter what it was. We covered Harry Potter and Love Wins and The Alchemist and a lot of different books that we went through and discussed together. And it's been, I got to tell you, I got a lot of positive discussion out of that. I heard from a lot of you. There's some great feedback and discussion, which is really what we were hoping for. And it kind of ended last week. But if you remember, there was one last vote that I dictated out. The last vote actually chose for the Apocrypha to be discussed. Now, what we're not going to do is completely discuss the Apocrypha today, but this is kind of an appendix. This is kind of an add-on bonus message to the book series, because I do want to address and frame a discussion today based on this idea of the Apocrypha. Now, the Apocrypha, like I mentioned last week if you were here, is a very loaded term. Apocrypha comes from Greek words. It's apo and krypha. And krypha is where we get the word crypt, which means hidden, like Tales from the Crypt. In fact, apo means from, so it's from the crypt or from the hidden. It's these hidden things is what the term Apocrypha means. The reason it's not a good term is because when you're talking about literature, and specifically ancient literature, Apocrypha can include all sorts of different literature, New Testament, Old Testament, different religions. But I know that the people that voted were voting for specifically this set of books that's really technically called the Deuterocanonical books. It's a mouthful. Say it 10 times fast, and you'll waste your life away. But it's a different term, and it means the second canon. And here's the history of it. Basically, we have all of these thousands of years of ancient history. I mean, we're talking about some of the most ancient, beautiful prose, poetry, wisdom literature, prophetic musings, all sorts of different things clumped into the Jewish Old Testament. And at the end of Malachi, the last book, there's 400 years before the writing of the first New Testament book, Matthew. Well, people didn't stop writing in those 400 years. They continued to write histories and psalms and songs and prayers and wisdom literature and all those things. And there became a debate early on as to if those books should be included in the Christian version of the Bible. And by the way, I'm going to tell you right now, there's never been a general consensus on this. And what I'm not going to do today, although I would love to because I nerd out on this stuff, is explain the process of how we've chosen in different veins of the church which books are considered the canon. That's the official term that means the standard or measuring rod in Greek. The canon means it's the measuring rod or the standard that all things are measured against. And Christians disagree about this. In fact, our brothers and sisters that are Roman Catholic include most of these intertestamental books within their Old Testament. The Jewish people no longer do that. That's kind of a funny little twist, because in Alexandria, about 150 years before Christ, The Jewish people actually did a very incredible feat in the ancient world of textual criticism. They were in this weird world of Jewish and Greek cultures combining at Alexandria, and they translated the entire Old Testament in the Greek language, and they included these books, which we now call the Apocrypha. So originally they were very proud of this, but then the early church said, yes, that's the Old Testament, took it, and then the Jewish people got offended and said, all right, let's cut those out because the Christians like it. So we have like this typical bitterness of religious people being ridiculous. But the idea is this. You can erase all that from your memory. It probably wasted your life. Here's the thing. Does any of it matter? Is there anything of value to take from these books that some Christians consider to be divine and others do not, and there's all this great stuff? And I would say absolutely yes. I mean, this is the gift of history inserted into this time that we don't know nothing about. And I want to introduce you to one specific thing from one book of the Apocrypha to point us towards Jesus today. Because the one thing we need to understand about these books and these 400 years that rolled into that moment of time where God decided to insert himself into human history is that Jesus and the followers of Jesus and the haters of Jesus and all the contemporary first century Palestine people, they knew about these books. These books affected them. In fact, it's written in their language. In fact, Jude even quotes a book that's not even considered in the Apocrypha. It influenced the authors of the New Testament. So it's important to understand the history that led up specifically to understanding who Jesus is. Now here's what I want you to hear. This is the great expectation piece of it. I think when we look specifically at these two books called the Maccabees, they're the most historical of the 13 books that are intertestamental, that are regarded by some to be part of the Bible. We see something very important about the expectation of who Jesus would be. And that's what I want to paint for you today. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you the life of 4 people that were contemporary to the life of Jesus very quickly, just to give you a picture of what people were expecting when Jesus showed up on the scene. The first of these is the most famous of all Jewish people. And you may not know this if you've grown up in a Christian heritage or non-Jewish heritage, but there's a guy named Judah the Hammer, or Judas Maccabee. In fact, Maccabee, scholars disagree. It could mean sledgehammer or hammer, or it might be an acronym for this great verse from Exodus 15 that he used as a battle cry, or it might even be an acronym of his father's name. But regardless, we know that Maccabee was his surname. And Judah the Hammer changed everything for them. You need to understand this, because I want you to hear this clearly. This is where it's going to come back to Jesus. The Jewish people had a history that repeated itself. By the way, I personally think it's a history that's written on all of our hearts. But basically, from the very beginning, from the Exodus story and the Babylonian captivity in the Old Testament, we see over and over again the same Disney theme we say played out all the time. A bad guy comes in, a hero rises up, he conquers in battle, and it's specific to the Jewish story. It always has something to do with the temple or the place of connection to God. And this happens over and over and over again. And it just happened again about 200 years exactly before the ministry of Jesus. Because at this time, the Romans were not the bad guys. At this time, there was a place called the Seleucid territory. It was basically where modern-day Syria is, and they controlled the whole world. Rome was trying to explode at the same time. There was tension everywhere. And there was a Seleucid king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And Epiphanes comes from the word epiphany, and he believed he was the manifestation of Zeus. He was a big Olympic god person, and he believed that he was Zeus in the flesh. And he got control of Jerusalem. By military force, he came in, and he was appalled by these Jewish people and their weird beliefs. He couldn't believe that they wouldn't eat pork, and he hated that they believed that there was some sort of personal God that created them, because he was Zeus incarnate. So the first thing he did is he went into the temple of the Holy of Holies, and he destroyed everything and made a huge altar to Zeus. And then he sacrificed pigs there because he knew pork was the most offensive thing to the Jewish people. Not a good guy. Not filled with love. But that's what the Jewish people were facing. The picture of their connection to God, remember, was the temple. The idea was the temple is supposed to be a place where sinful humans can reconnect to a holy and loving God. And yet here comes yet another bad guy, just like the Egyptians, just like the Babylonians, who's conquered them and done the worst thing they can possibly do. Well, then Judah the Hammer rises up. And there's a lot of correlations between Jesus. I'll try to keep it short. But basically, he had a 3-year campaign similar to Jesus' 3-year ministry. And him and his brothers rose up and they had battle victories. And then the ultimate piece, 3 years after he began his mission, he was able to cleanse the temple. He went back in the temple and he cleansed out all the pagan things and brought back the Jewish rite of the temple. And that's what they celebrated Hanukkah, or Chanukah, depending on how you pronounce it. Because there was supposedly a miracle of these lampstands that stay lit. The oil lasted longer than it should. And to this day, it's the most celebrated and important thing to the Jewish people. It was written on their heart that there's going to be a hero that's going to rise up. He's going to defeat the bad guy, and he's going to cleanse the temple. The next one was Herod the Great. Because after they were driven out, the Romans ended up becoming the bad guys. And a half-Jewish man by the name of Herod, he kind of sided with the Romans. And he became evil in the process, but he did all the same things. He had huge military battle victories. He kicked out all the Seleucid armies. And then he became king, and he reigned, and he did all these horrific things. But he ended up being the worst possible king. But he got this title that's really significant. They started calling him the King of the Jews. That's really important. It probably already rings a bell where we're going with Jesus in this. And then there was these two other guys, contemporary to Jesus, a little bit after Jesus was the first one. His name was Simon Bar Giora, which means son of Giora. And Simon came right at the pinnacle of Rome's empire takeover of Jerusalem. I don't know how many of you know this, but about 30 or 40 years after Jesus was crucified and resurrected, Rome obliterated Jerusalem. In fact, that's a lot of what Jesus was talking about in his Olivet Discourse. He was trying to tell them this was coming. But there was a guy that rose up, and his name was Simon, and he said, "We will stop the Romans." And he gathered an army, and he fought, and he got completely crushed by the Romans. In fact, the historians don't really understand if he committed suicide or ran away. But yet again, the story repeated itself. A huge bad empire, a hero rises up, and yet again, the hero fails. And then 100 years after Christ, this is the last example, there was a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba, which means Simon, the son of the star. And the rabbis of the day, we know this because they wrote a lot of literature, said that he is the Messiah. Of course, they didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. This is 100 years later. And there was yet another oppression of the Jewish people. And he yet rose up again. And again, he had a 3-year campaign. In fact, we still have his coins that they started counting the years. Year 1, year 2, year 3, where he led up a revolt and had some success. And they believed he was the Messiah. And yet again, he got squished and ran to a cave. And all of a sudden, they said, he's now Simon, son of the lie. He wasn't the Messiah. Now, does any of that have anything to do with anything? Yes. When we talk about expectation, and you understand the contemporary environment that Jesus showed up on the scene, we'll begin to get a picture of how shocking the life of Jesus was. The Jewish people had a very, very, very specific idea about how God was going to work within Israel. They were always of a kingdom mindset. They always understood that God's plan was he was going to rescue his people. And so they had this idea of Messiah. And their expectation was it was going to be somebody like the hammer. It was going to be somebody like Simon, son of the star. Somebody heroic and bold and violent will come kick out a foreign opposing army, and then Israel, the government, will reign forever. That was their expectation. So naturally we can see how Jesus probably fell into when people were listening to him, when they were seeing the things that he were doing in the middle of a time where Rome had just put in a governor, Pontius Pilate, instead of a Jewish person. They were feeling the oppression. In fact, they were looking at prophecies that go back to Daniel, and they were doing the math and saying, okay, at this point there was the abomination of desolation where Antiochus came in and said that he was God in our temple. Daniel said 70 years after that, there would be the end judgment. That's exactly when Jesus had his ministry. It was 70 years later. All the people were saying, this has got to be Jesus. He's got to be the Messiah. You see it echoed throughout the gospel. The question is always looming. Are you the Messiah? And this is what I really want you to hear. Jesus constantly asked that beautiful question, who do you say that I am? The reason that's important is because the identity of Jesus, you're going to see this in a second, has everything to do with our own identity. So then we have this political environment. And all of a sudden we find out that there's 10 to 15,000 people at times that will follow Jesus because of his attractive and polarizing personality. That's a huge crowd in ancient times. Herod noticed it. Herod's descendant Herod noticed it. Rome noticed it. The Jewish authorities noticed it. They started to realize this is another one of those guys. He's the Messiah. Now I want to look at a couple scriptures today before we land the plane here. The first one is really interesting. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the liturgical calendar, but in church history, there's been a calendar of scripture readings that goes around, and almost every mainline denomination, I mean Catholic and Lutheran and Orthodox, in fact, I would estimate about 1.5 billion Christians in the world follow this liturgical calendar, and it happens to be the passage we're going to look at today. And I just think that's really cool that today 1.5 billion of our brothers and sisters are looking at this really strange passage, but hopefully it will bring some light on this expectation of who Jesus is. This is in Luke chapter 9, and I actually want to start a little bit higher in verse 46 to show you that Jesus' disciples, by the way, were very much convinced that he was going to be a political warring king. They were so excited as he was headed towards Jerusalem. They were already arguing about who would be the highest ranking in his new regime as they took over and conquered Rome. And I just love this passage because it's so simple. It says, an argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. And then he said to them, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is the least among you all who is the greatest. Now there's similar stories. Jesus multiple times pulls up children as an example. He says that we have to have faith like a child. He's basically saying kids get it, adults don't get it. They've got the intellect and all this crazy stuff, but sometimes children have the purest and simplest understanding of the love of their Father. Now specifically in this context, he's already flipping the paradigm. He's changing the expectation because they're expecting to ride into Jerusalem and conquer. They're expecting battle. They're expecting cleansing the temple, which there's going to be a different version of. They're expecting all that. And he says right at the beginning, the least among you is the greatest. That's what I love about Jesus. His upside down and backwards philosophies to the world's philosophies of power and might in the greatest is one of the things that makes me super attracted to the person of Jesus. He understood that humility is better than pride. Now let's skip down to the part of the liturgical calendar. This is verse 51. This is what it says. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, or ascension in the Greek term. In other words, Dr. Luke is transitioning his whole gospel account. Remember, he told us at the beginning, as a historian to Theophilus, his friend, I'm doing all the research I can to give the very best historical detail of what happened. This is the part where he transitions the whole story, aiming towards the end, where the kingdom of heaven, where Jesus goes right back to that intermix of kingdom of heaven and earth. And it says that Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Some of your translations probably say, set his face towards Jerusalem. There's a Greek and Hebrew idiom here that means he set his face like flint. He sharpened his features and said, I am going to Jerusalem. And one of the reasons I love that is because, see, we know the end of the story. We know what happens in Jerusalem. And Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen in Jerusalem. And he made up his mind. He premeditated his loving act. So he's pointed toward Jerusalem, and then some weird stuff happens in verse 52. And he sent messengers on ahead, who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. Time out. We've talked about the Samaritans a lot. In fact, if you remember, last week we talked about the Good Samaritan and the shock value that Jesus had when he basically threw away all racial and all gender-specific stuff and said, it doesn't matter if you're racially different or religious or women, with the Good Samaritan and the Samaritan woman at the well. He did not care about those issues. He cared about human hearts. But in this case, the Samaritans, which is right in line with what we know historically, they hear from his followers that they're headed towards Jerusalem, and Samaritans hate Jerusalem. They set up their own temple on Mount Gerizim. They were kind of what the Jewish people considered half-breeds at the time because of the separate Temple Mount. So they said, if you're going to Jerusalem, you're not one of us, and you're not welcome here. So even though Jesus had shown so much kindness to Samaritans and used them as in parables of the ones lifted up and doing the right things, they rejected Jesus. And so the disciples got a little defensive about this. This is what they said. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them? I think that's one of the weirdest questions a human being has ever asked, ever. Now, it makes a little more sense in the Jewish context because they have this story in the Old Testament of how Elijah could call down fire because someone was an enemy of God. But see, what they didn't understand is that to Jesus, Samaritans weren't enemies of God. Jesus didn't mind that they had this nationalistic political heritage that kept them from understanding what was going on. It's interesting, it's very mild here, but Luke tells us, but Jesus turned and rebuked them. And then he said, he and his disciples went on to another village. Now here's the interesting thing. We don't know for sure what he said when he rebuked them for this really strange request. We have some idea actually, because in the way that the Bible is passed on early in the earliest manuscripts that people wrote of Luke's gospel, they're starting to become a variation in the text here. It's not in our English Bible, but it goes on to say after this, he says he rebuked them by saying, I did not come to destroy, but I came to save. It is almost impossible that Luke actually wrote that phrase. But it is very possible that the early church, when writing this down, remembered that Jesus did rebuke them in that way. These are people who knew Jesus that were talking about it, that added that in at some point. Now, I'm glad our Bible doesn't have it because I respect that the writers of the Bible and the compilers have always gone with the most difficult passage. They've always gone with the for sure thing instead of adding it in. But the idea is certainly true. Because John tells us the same thing. He did not come to condemn the world. He came to save it. And here again, we see where expectations are being flipped. James and John. Remember, John was one of the closest best friends of Jesus. And James was also in his inner circle of the top 3. These guys were still wanting war and battle. They still wanted to call down fire on the Samaritans on their way to Jerusalem when they conquer Rome and bring in the Israel that they had in mind forever. But here's the cool thing. Something way better was in store for them. They made the same mistake that people still make to this day. By the way, don't think Christians aren't guilty of this. It's not just Jewish followers trying to find a Messiah. It's human beings. We have this terrible bend in us towards violence and towards power. And Christians have done the same thing. And the darkest scars in our past was when Christians have stopped following Jesus and they started to act just like the disciples wanted to here. They want to bring in violence and power and put Christianity in power. And Jesus says, it's not about that. I'm not about condemning people. I'm not about conquering people. I'm about loving and saving. One last verse I want to look at before we close this down. John 6. John, who was there that day, wrote this. And remember, John, when he wrote this, was an elderly man. And I think it's funny that he was one of those that's saying, let's call down fire from heaven on a town. As he's an older man and followed Jesus for many years and even watched the destruction of Jerusalem happen long after Jesus, he records the life of Jesus. And in John 6, he records a really incredible miracle. In fact, it's one of the few miracles that all 4 of the Gospels contain. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in John 6, he tells this beautiful and strange story about how the attractiveness of Jesus has brought tens of thousands of people up on a hillside, and they can't feed them, and Jesus in his godness somehow provides. And all of a sudden, he miraculously, with just a few fish and just a little bit of bread, it extends to everyone, and they eat their fill, is what these authors say. By the way, these authors were there, and they were killed for what they wrote. And they could have said, no, it isn't true. But they didn't. They said, I saw that bread be multiplied. I saw it happen. I want to skip down at the end of this because this is where it gets interesting. This is verse 12 of John 6. It says, when they had all had enough to eat after this great miracle, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over and let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with pieces of 5 barley loaves left over those who had eaten them. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who's to come into the world. You hear the echo again? It's the echo of history. They're still thinking, surely this is the Messiah. This is the one that's going to rescue us just because of this miracle. And it says, Jesus, knowing that they had intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again by a mountain by himself. See, Jesus understood that they wanted to force him to be a political king. And yet he always talked about this kingdom. His idea is, I'm bringing a message that a kingdom is now here. And yet every time people wanted to make him king or force him to do that, he withdrew away from it. He started talking with these upside-down philosophies about serving, being better, and being least instead of greatest. And it was just this confusing thing going on. And then I want to skip over later in 6 because I think this is really interesting. This whole miracle with the doubling of bread, the people, just like us, if we experienced, thought it was all about the magic show. They wanted more of it. They get into this conversation. They follow him around the lake, and there's all this stuff going on. And they're saying, okay, if you're the prophet, show us more miraculous signs. And he's trying to explain to them that that miracle was not about bringing power into the world. It's about something more allegorical and more deeply true. And they get into this conversation about what is the bread. And they're saying, give us a sign. Like back in the Old Testament, God sent manna, which was a type of bread from heaven. Give us that sign. And here's Jesus' beautiful and simple answer in 35. This is what I want you to hear. Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. One of the many I am statements that John uses to talk about Jesus. And he's saying that miracle was great. I know you want to make me king because I have this power, because I'm God squeezed in a human body, but you're missing the point. The point is you're physically hungry and you want more physical bread, but I'm the real bread. I'm the real life. And here's what I want you to hear. Here's the thing that the human beings couldn't understand when God showed up. When they're looking for a rescuer, when they're looking for an enemy, they always look to the outside, a country that was taking over. America could do the same thing. We can turn to politics. We can always find a bad guy. But when Jesus came as the true Messiah and the true King, he did everything backwards. And his enemy was not Rome. And it wasn't Syria, and it wasn't Parthia, it wasn't Armenia, it was none of the surrounding powers. His enemy has always been the same. It's always been death. Jesus came to conquer death. From the very beginning of the Tanakh and these Jewish stories, we find that the problem with the world is sin and death and brokenness. And by death, I mean separation from God. Because see, Jesus, God the Father, understands that every one of us is hardwired for intimate relationship with the divine. The connection point at the temple has always been to be us reconnecting with God. And Jesus, when he showed up, didn't come here to beat Rome. He came here to beat death, to bring life. John 10:10, the most beautiful verses, I come that you may have life and have it to the fullest. That was the kingdom he was ushering in. A kingdom of life, a kingdom of love. It wasn't what they were expecting, but it was incredibly better. And by the way, I think this is kind of ironic and beautiful. The kingdom that Jesus created has far outlived the Roman Empire. He never fought a battle. In fact, when they came to arrest him, even though he showed them with the power of his words, when he said, I am, and 600 Roman soldiers fell back, and then he allowed them to take them away. Peter draws a sword, and he's saying, don't do that. You're going to die by the sword. He didn't bring violence, and yet his kingdom is still here. 2 billion strong, and the Roman Empire is long gone. Because he brought a kingdom of life and love and transformation. Well, so what? How's that relevant for all of us sitting in these chairs today? Here's what I want you to hear. We're not that different than the people that lived 200 years before Jesus, or 100 years after him, or right there next to Jesus when he was speaking. And what I mean by that is we have expectations of who Jesus is. We have expectations of everything. And they taint or enhance whatever it is that we experience. And my question is, what is your expectation of Jesus? What is it that you expect of Jesus? And I would imagine, and one of the things I love about this community is how diverse it is. And we come from all sorts of different backgrounds and have a lot of different pictures of Jesus. And when I echo that question from Jesus from so long ago, who do you say that I am? I imagine there's a different response from almost all of you. And I think for some of you, you have no expectation because you don't even believe he existed. And for you, I would challenge you to reach into history and see the evidence for this historical person and the things that he said. And there's some of you who say, well, yeah, I think Jesus existed maybe, but he was just a good moral teacher that people got really carried away. And I would say for you, if that's your expectation of Jesus, look deeper. Be challenged by the things that Jesus said because he claimed to be God, thereby eliminating the option that he's a good teacher if he wasn't God. He's only a liar or a lunatic otherwise. And look at the evidence of the resurrection. Could he back up his claim to be divine? And some of you have different expectations. Some of you maybe are trying to follow Christ, but you believe he's some sort of good luck charm or a miracle worker. You believe that he, just like the people who are following to get more bread, that Jesus is just going to supernaturally fix your life. You believe that he doesn't want any pain in your life or anything uncomfortable, and he will come in and miraculously fix it all. And he would say, I've got a better story for you. I want to just be in your life. I need the pain. I need these things that were created to draw us into intimate closeness with him, but he offers himself. It's a better expectation. We have all sorts of things we bring to the table when we look at Jesus, but there is one truth. I was thinking about this. I was reading a book by G.K. Chesterton. He was a huge influence on C.S. Lewis. And sometimes it can get overwhelming because as we start talking about these relative perceptions of Jesus, we might be tempted to say, well, is there any central truth about who Jesus is? How are we to know whose perception is the real deal? And G.K. Chesterton, a great philosopher in the UK a long time ago in the modern era, he looked back and said, it's almost as if you heard of a man from a distant land, and you heard of him from different people. And some people describe him as tall, and some people describe him as shorter, and they had these different perceptions, and you're kind of in the same quandary of how do I know? But what he's saying is the fact that these people have these perceptions imply that there is an actual man, and there is an actual truth as to how tall that man is. And the same is true of Jesus. The truth of who he is and the kingdom that he brings is completely centered on the backward concept of dying to self. This is the truth that the Bible thematically and clearly teaches us. Jesus didn't come and conquer with violence. He came and brought self-sacrificial love. He took the punishment that we deserve so that we can have that connection with God. That's the truth. That's the standard. That's the canon. That's the real Jesus. A connection point with God. So as we enter a time of communion today, I want you to challenge yourself by asking that question, what is your expectation of Jesus? And I will tell you that whatever your expectation is, the truth is so much better. Because the truth is his unconditional crazy love for you. The truth is what we're celebrating at communion is what he was talking about that day with the miracle of bread. He is the bread. And that's what we remember at the communion table. We take Jesus into us. That is our connection with God. This is the mysterious thing that, as diverse and wonderful as the church has been for 2,000 years, we've always done this. Because Jesus told us this is the best way to remember him. We take this bread, we take this wine and grape juice, and they are pictures of his body and his blood and his upside-down thinking that are ushered in a kingdom of complete love. So in this communion time, it's an optional time. Any of you are welcome to do this if you want to take Jesus serious. Completely optional. We have 4 different places. As the music plays, think about that question. What do you expect about Jesus? And who do you say that he is? Let me pray for this time. God, thank you. Thank you for the things that we can resonate with from these ancient stories. God, I know that I constantly am just so human and natural, and I constantly jockey for power and do weird things, and I just don't act like you, God. And I'm thankful that you have revealed to us a different life. Life that is truly life, God. Filled with love and self-sacrifice and connection to you. And Lord, at this communion table today, we acknowledge that you are here. And we begin, as the term Eucharist means, by thanking you for your unconditional love, God. Thank you that we don't have to fix who we are or change anything about us to come to this table, because it's about you and not us. Thank you that you love me exactly how I am before I change. And God, I thank you that that changes me. And I thank you that that's true for our whole community. So at this time of communion, God, we remember your body broken for us, so that you set your face so strongly to Jerusalem to give yourself up for us. Your blood, which gives us the forgiveness of sins, God. The sweet forgiveness that we long for, God. The hope of true life, forgiven and loved and overflowing in love to others. We give you this time and thank you for this table. I got to sneak outside for a second. You're in for a treat. It's like it turned into monsoon season officially while you were in here. It's so sweet outside. So I'll hurry so you can go breathe that fresh air. Here's the thing. What happened with Jesus, counterintuitive to the expectations of the day, it did change everything. It was in a completely radical and different new way. It was basically insanely relational. Instead of a conquering army, there became a bunch of scared Jewish guys who found somebody resurrected, and then they all of a sudden became really bold and went out and started loving people. And our dream for this little community right here is that we do that. That we get real crazy about figuring out what it looks like to follow Jesus. We hang out together, we ask questions, we grow relationally, we love people, and hopefully that will change the expectation of our community in the world. Because I don't know about you, but I get really sick of what Christianity really does in the world. I get really embarrassed sometimes of what Christians have become, because we act like power-mongering, weird religious people instead of human beings who have figured out that they are deeply and securely loved by their Father. Because I think that will change everything, including the world's expectation. Let me pray for you guys, and you guys can take off and enjoy the weather. God, thank you. Thank you for this family. Thank you for the beautiful weather outside. And Lord, I just pray that as we leave here, we'll be together, we'll discuss things, we'll grow together. And God, I pray that we will love in the strange, upside-down, self-sacrificial, loving way that you did. We love you and thank you for your love. In Jesus' name, amen.
And if anyone is interested in the Africa trip, we'll meet right here in like 2 minutes. How about?